Now, as you see in the program, our first keynote will be presented by a board member and active member of ESITIS, a dear friend and colleague, Professor Nicholas Adams. He's professor of philosophical theology at the University of Birmingham in the UK. Nick Adams is the author of studies on Hegel and Habermas. His primary interest is in the relationship of philosophy and theology in the European traditions. And he has special focus on philosophical problems in interreligious engagement. He has been a leading practitioner of scriptural reasoning for the last 25 years, and you're still so young, with particular interest in its capacity to resist instrumentalization. So, dear Nick, the floor is yours, please. You have 30 minutes, you know, and after that, we want to have more time for discussions and answering questions. And prepare yourself for the questions, please.
Well, good evening, everyone. Special thanks to the European Society for inviting me to speak to you, and special thanks to the Dean at her department, and thanks to Anna for hosting us in such a wonderful city and a wonderful university. I'm particularly delighted to see students from the university here and look forward to learning from you what you think the hot button issues are in interreligious engagement here. So my paper is called Funding and Beards, Challenges to Interreligious Engagement. This lecture is an exercise in asking the right questions more than giving the right answers. So that means in 30 minutes' time, if I have discharged my tasks competently, we'll have a well-defined problem and some accompanying questions that the problem gives rise to. I envisage it as the task of the whole conference to refine and answer some of these questions. So my task, with your encouragement and your help, is to make a strong and honest beginning. So some contextual preliminaries. We meet here in Tartu, a city with a population of nearly 100,000, a city of intellectuals and of song. European Capital of Culture 2024. We're a bit late to celebrate 100 years of Estonian original independence. That milestone was in 2018. And we're also too late to celebrate with you 30 years since the second independence. That was in 2021. The ethnicity of the population is 80% Estonian, 13% Russian, and just over 5% others. And at the last census in 2021, I understand 77% of the population declared itself unaffiliated with any religious tradition, 10% Lutheran, 8.5% Orthodox and Old Believers. You'll have to Google Old Believers, that's a local specialty. And 2% other Christians and 2% other religions or unknown. So that's the context here. I am an Anglican theologian currently worshipping in a charismatic evangelical church in a suburb of the English city of Birmingham. My mother's family emigrated from Ireland and Germany to England in the early 20th century, and my father's family were factory engineers and watchmakers in London. I am the first Cambridge-educated member of my family with a degree in music and theology. I'm a white male with a family and a mortgage. I'm a professor in the University of Birmingham, right in the middle of England. It's literally called the Midlands. Birmingham is arguably the most religiously diverse large city in the world. 30% Christian, 30% Muslim, 30% no religion, and the remaining 10% Sikhs, Hindus, Buddhists, Jews, and others. I advise bishops in the Church of England, a task to which I devote considerable time and love, and as Yasser said, I have for 25 years been a practitioner and theorist, in that order, of scriptural reasoning, a method of interreligious engagement whose focus is studying texts together. Now, I want to take a couple of things for granted. So this session is part of a discussion of the theme of violence, and that's to say the tendency in much academic discussion to treat religion as something violent. So I take that for granted. I also take for granted that in the field of interreligious studies we're concerned with questions of inclusion and exclusion. My question is much narrower, which is what effects does it have on interreligious practice to think of religion as inherently something violent and something problematic? And so the research I did was simply to find out what are scholars outside our discipline saying about interreligious engagement, interfaith dialogue. And I wanted to talk to you about what's happening in Britain. Fascinatingly, there is almost nothing in the literature at a high academic level about interreligious engagement in Britain. So that's a task for us. But there's a lot about interfaith and interreligious dialogue in Germany. And so I have consulted some German sources, some of which are in German, and I thought I'd do a translation job to try and think about the German context, because that's the most sophisticated. So our question is partly to think, how might our own individual contexts relate to some of the issues that are investigated in the German context? I think there's a lot of overlap. So this is not an attempt to single out a particular country for criticism or investigation, so much as to take a particular case study, 3 cities in fact, and then think about how they might apply to our own contexts. So everything I'm going to say from now on concerns the German context because of the high level of investigation by geographers, social scientists, and political scientists. So, German interfaith dialogue. In 2006, the sociologist Levent Tezcan proposed a thesis to explain the growth and character of interfaith dialogue in Germany. He says, "My basic thesis is that religion is increasingly the vehicle with which the multicultural society is to be made governable. There had been socially marginal small group practices of Christian-Muslim dialogue since the late 1980s, and things changed decisively after 9/11. From the state side, these structures were more formally linked to integration policy as a tool of government, and from the religious side, this new visibility and importance compensated for their weakness as a publicly relevant force in an increasingly secular Germany." Tezcan draws important distinctions. On the one hand, there are local initiatives which connect Muslim communities via their local leaders, both to Christian communities and to civic services such as the fire brigade, who might want to know how to respond to a mosque fire. On the other hand, there are impressive international interfaith set pieces, and as already mentioned, Hans Kung's global ethic. So on the one hand, there are local Muslim leaders, often themselves Gastarbeiter from modest backgrounds. On the other hand, there are impressive German theology professors with massive social capital who take the lead on the Christian side. On the one hand, there are Muslim participants who are content to engage in practical shared action. On the other hand, there are Christian participants who desire meaningful or more generative, deeper heart-to-heart dialogue. So the field is, for Tezcan, marked by asymmetries. And what makes his analysis compelling is his observation that these asymmetries, scale, social status, pragmatism versus depth, are interrelated and shape each other. Participants' social status may shape their desire for merely pragmatic engagement, for example. Tezcan's most important observation from our point of view is that the dialogue creates its own subjects. Briefly, it's not the case that there are 2 or more ready-made groups who come together in dialogue. Rather, the imperatives of dialogue create new Muslim subjects who must announce themselves for integration and against extremism. Participants must become, and they must confess themselves, the right kind of Muslims. Tezcan's genius lies in foregrounding contrasts and contradictions. So we've already just seen the contrasts of scale, international versus local, of status, professors versus Gastarbeiter, and goals, deep dialogue versus pragmatism. His final contradiction is between the governmental desire for Muslim versions of Christian structures, academies, schools, hospitals, kindergartens. This is in contradiction to a governmental fear of parallel structures, where Muslim communities create their own ecologies with a high degree of independence. He observes dryly in one sentence, "This problem will not easily be solved." So this discussion is from nearly 20 years ago, and it's striking how contemporary it sounds in some ways. It is, however, largely focused on the national level at a high degree of generality, and there is a striking absence. There's no mention of universities. More recent German discussions, which build on Tezcan's account, have more to say on this, and they're more local. Tezcan's analysis, I should say, has been extended by Shirin Amir Muazzami in a paper, Dialogue as Governmental Technique, Managing Gendered Islam in Germany, from 2011, and its focus is the National Deutsche Islam Conference, established in 2006, the same year as Tezcan's study. My summary of her paper would be something like this. Dialogue often presents itself as a liberal activity while concealing its power dynamics and techniques. It is not the encounter of two unknown subjects around indeterminate criteria to pursue open understanding. On the contrary, its criteria are often fixed by the more powerful party. Its goals are often openly specified, namely, the reshaping of an initially problematic difference between traditions. And this means, in practice, reshaping the subjectivity of the others through governmental power, in which certain norms are regarded as normal and others as deviancy. And the state-funded aim is to eliminate deviancy and to establish normalcy. The practice is often highly regulated, yet in such a way as to form subjects who see their activity as self-regulated. It is heavily guided, but in such a way that subjects should see their activity as self-guided. So the first of three studies. The first, the city of Erlangen. Jan Winkler's paper, Friends Lead Each Other, Communal Political Dialogue with Islam in the Mode of a Governmentality of Friendship, funded by the DFG. And Winkler is a postdoc geographer at the University of Erlangen. Winkler draws out the aspect of Tezcan's discussion where German ideals about Islam must appear to develop within Muslim communities, and they must develop of their own accord, von selbst. It's important that government imperatives appear spontaneously in the guise of Muslim-led impulses towards friendship. Winkler's Erlangen case study attempts to identify the conditions under which this apparently spontaneous form of action arises, marked by personal encounters, informality, trust, but how they at the same time produce high levels of conformity to governmental imperatives. Winkler notes in stronger terms than Tezcan that integration policies are increasingly carried out by Muslim communities themselves, and this has notable effects. Problems in integration policy can be treated as Islamic problems, and responsibility for policy rests with Muslim leaders who must articulate these policies in Muslim terms. What is the mechanism by which this magic is carried out? Interfaith dialogue. Tejan has described a new Muslim subject, ready to identify themselves as Muslims, which of course means ready to identify themselves as the right kind of Muslims, self-aware, ethically and politically responsible, a cultural representative who is very clearly for faith and for peace and against extremism. Winkler develops this into a longer and more specific list in the Erlangen context. The Muslim subject must announce themselves as dialogue-ready, theologically self-reflective, secular, socio-politically motivated, transparent, friendly, and emotionally open. And so the field work he did in Erlangen was particularly attentive, as he says, to physical movements, mimicry, gestures, and tone of voice. Such subjects are regulated in the Erlangen interfaith dialogue by a new class of post-secular religious experts who are typically drawn from the majority Christian culture. They see themselves as experts in religion, which they are. But Winkler suggests that more significantly, they are experts in the dynamics of trust and friendship. Muslim subjects perform successfully when they talk about their feelings and the importance of friendship with members of other religious traditions. And Winkler refers to this as the establishment of emotional terrain in which interfaith dialogue serves as a training ground in emotional disclosure. In Erlangen, the institutional bodies who produce these effects are not the official organs of government. The city outsources this to a local network of Muslim communities. Significant government funding is provided to these Muslim networks, who then employ Muslim project staff to deliver local government policy goals. As evidence, Winkler quotes from the city of Erlangen's own official report. Quote, "Project staff are able to work authentically and confidentially in the Islamic communities due to their social and religious background." So the new Muslim subject is authentically Muslim, and their prime task, funded by the city, is to establish trust. The conditions for this performance are complex. Two new institutions are involved: the Christian Islamic Working Group, CIAG, established by the mayor in 1996, and the Muslim Communities Friendship Circle, FMGE, founded by the city in 2010. Both are moderated by a person who identifies openly as a Christian spokesperson, but who also happens to be a member of the SPD, who run the city council. And it's noted in passing that the university is represented in both forums, just in passing. Neither group, the CIAG or the FMGE, has an official internet presence, in contrast to many other Islamic initiatives and community projects. So as well as noting the overlap of networks in relation to official government policies, Winkler notes that the tone of the meetings is carefully arranged to be informal, relaxed, and above all, friendly. And he describes this as a crucial mechanism of what he calls the governmentality of friendship. Winkler's analysis focuses on these in part because they're such striking features, but more importantly, perhaps, because these features are emphasized in local political discourse about religious encounter. It's what people say about themselves. We're friends. So the management of friendship fosters an environment in which difficult topics can then be addressed. Winkler identifies Islam and religious violence as one topic. But a cursory review of the official website of the Islamic community in Erlangen, IGE, reveals a program inside the Muslim community, which include extensive discussion of the right way to understand jihad, and an entire lecture series called Developing an Even-Tempered and Muslim Personality. And these are now part of a regular informal curriculum for young German Muslims in the city. So for Winkler, a key dynamic is the way in which issues of leadership and formation are recoded in interreligious dialogue simply as well-meaning advice. Advice between friends. The role of the mayor's participation is also central. The mayor regularly gives speeches of praise of the Muslim community, and this praise functions essentially to describe how the Muslim community should be, while invoking a mythology of trust and friendship. This mythology itself performs important work. It's experienced as moving and empowering by all parties, especially, he says, on the Muslim side. So the mechanisms for aligning values seem transparent to the participants, who reflect explicitly on how to be friendly, how to avoid coercion. And Winkler reports, he did ethnography, the following transparent speech given by a Christian to the Muslim group. Listen, we don't want to impose anything on you. We'll show you how it could be done, but that's not the only way. Please convey to the communities that we want from the bottom of our hearts for something to emerge here that strengthens Muslims in your self-understanding, in your self-awareness. Take time to think about whether this is what you want. Winkler names this governing through friendship. The language of self-determination is deployed in order to elicit transformed understandings spontaneously from within the Muslim community. Chief among these understandings are commitments to self-reflection and self-criticism, especially when Muslim voices might be in danger of appearing dogmatic or elaborate a form of Islam that's considered strict or legalistic. These are the wrong kinds of Islam. These transformed understandings align closely with those of the sponsoring institutions, city, university, civic interfaith groups. They then spontaneously become the guiding values for Muslim education projects designed and led by Muslims from within, with friendly facilitation by Christian moderators who explicitly deny imposing anything on anyone. The second case, which I will just very briefly allude to, is the case of Hamburg. The authors of the report on Hamburg also draw attention to the ways in which integration policy is at the heart of interfaith practice, but they largely view this as a good and positive thing. Their critical note, though, is in developing what they call urban myths of conviviality. That's to say, the city of Hamburg presents itself as a place where people can be convivial together, and this is what makes interfaith work possible. But I want to give a bit more time to the final case, Osnabrück. So this case is a report by Ali Konyali, Laura Haddad, and Andreas Pott, Pacifying Muslims in Germany's City of Peace, Interreligious Dialogue as a Tool of Governance in Osnabrück, a research funded by the DFG. That's Konyali et al., 2019. And these are researchers who work on migration, on women's fashion in Islam, and social geography on migration. So Konyali et al. Describe the mechanisms of operative control in interfaith dialogue as pitfalls, inadvertent effects, unintended effects. In other words, what interreligious actors do here is not intended to control. It just has those effects. And he says, we joined a wide range of events and gathering and took detailed notes of everything that they observed. In a manner similar to Winkler, the aim is to account for the production of Muslim identities through interreligious dialogue in an urban setting. So they suggest that interreligious dialogue is persuasive for some local participants because it is guided by a semantics of homology. What is this monster? It just means saying to everyone that we have so much in common and underplaying differences. So Osnabrück's defining narrative about itself is, "We are a city of peace," an idea extending back to its role in the Peace of Westphalia of 1648. In the early 1990s, there was a project to establish peace culture, and around 15 years later, a round table of religions was set up. Like the Hamburg case, and different from the Erlangen case, the Osnabrück approach involves Christians, Muslims, and Jews, but the round table also includes the mayor of Osnabrück and a representative of the Osnabrück Landkreis. And it was at the time of publication in 2019 led by its founder, a retired professor in the University Institute for Protestant Theology. So it's thus a clear example of an overlap between religious and civic agencies, with figures of high social rank on the Christian and governmental side, while describing itself as wholly independent and unofficial. At the 10th anniversary of the Round Table, its chair made a particular point in his speech that it functions as a bridge between city administration and religious communities. So the formal official function is acknowledged in the most public way possible, while also being narrated as completely unofficial and totally informal. So this appears to be a recurring feature of interreligious bodies in the three cities. And this impression is deepened by the participation in interreligious engagement by the dialogue officer of the police directorate, or the centrality of interreligious debates and discussions during events celebrating the city's cultural diversity. Interreligious engagement is, one might say, a core element in Osnabrück's public brand. Unlike the cases of Erlangen and Hamburg, Cornali and his colleagues draw attention to the significance of the Institute of Islamic Theology. I won't say any more about that here, but we could bring some discussion perhaps later, asking about university roles in these discussions. Just as Winkler suggests for Erlangen, so the relatively small size of Osnabrück plays a factor. But whereas Winkler says that makes the city more manageable, Cornali et al. Link it to the relatively small number of participants in interreligious dialogue. They are publicly prominent, and they all know each other very well. The recurring point is that while the structure and function of interreligious dialogue is formally to connect government with minority communities and to produce a compliant and integrated Muslim body, the rhetoric used is always informal, and the stated goals are acceptance, mutual respect, appreciation. In Winkler's terms, control is narrated as friendship. Cornali et al. Make this explicit. Our observations contradict the claim that this is a dialogue among equal partners, for the partners are not equal. At one meeting, it is reported, there were 3 Muslim representatives. 2 of them did not speak German well enough to follow the proceedings. They did not engage, and they left before the meeting had finished. So it appears that the Osnabrück Round Table is more tightly controlled than the Erlangen CIAG. It's more strongly marked by Christian professorial authority. It produces very smooth press releases controlling the narrative. Yet, in contrast with Erlangen, it connects much less meaningfully with local Muslim actors. So Winkler, in his Erlangen case, is concerned with the manipulation of emotion, but here in Osnabrück it appears there's not much emotion at all. It's presented more of a public performance, a matter of civic pride, emphatic about its own success. Now, it's suggested, as we know in our field, that one of the hazards of interreligious dialogue is the exclusion of minority voices within minority traditions. Cornali et al. Know this literature well. This literature has been produced by people in this room. And perhaps this shapes their perceptions. But they offer the following observation as interpretation of what they observed in Osnabrück. A necessary condition for local interreligious dialogue seems to be that politically extreme positions are excluded, but the demand for constructive cooperation results in even broader restrictions. Communities regarded as unorthodox by more established Muslim associations are also being excluded from the Round Table in order to ensure the continued participation of other larger Muslim communities. Thus, local interreligious dialogue favours harmony over conflict, with the consequence of limiting diversity. So this has some striking further effects. The Round Table has no observable critical voices. Everything is always a success. And there are no actual struggles around the table, although the mayor, in official speeches, often describes interreligious dialogue as always a struggle. So interreligious dialogue is thus imagined as an encounter with difference, with many difficulties, in a city almost uniquely suited to the challenge, they say, because it is a city of peace. But in fact, it's practiced as a revolving agenda of choreographed successes with no actual obstacles. Now, the idea that the city of peace is exceptional, which is what the practitioners always say, would be received with surprise in Erlangen and Hamburg, and in fact probably in any other city in Germany. Kurz and Nagel, in their study of Hamburg, noticed that Hamburg brands itself the capital of interreligious dialogue. And I must say I'm reminded of the tendency of British universities to describe themselves as exceptional, and they do so in exactly the same way as each other. So Cornali's account resembles in some ways a description of an illusionist's performance, and it's noteworthy that Muslim academics in the Institute for Islamic Studies willingly contribute to this performance and publicly celebrate the exceptionality of Osnabrück. Striking perhaps, but not surprising. It's strongly implied by Cornali and al. That this is in fact part of their job, and they perform it with professional competence. But there is dissent. The authors report a panel discussion at a local community college where a loud complaint was made by an audience member that the whole thing, a discussion of state and religion, could not be taken seriously because the professorial moderator was just about the most prominent emblem of overlapping religious and civic roles. And he complained such conditions meant that real controversies were likely to be swept under the carpet. So the core issue is one of participation. There's no shortage of events, symposiums, panels, meetings of the Round Table, but the figures who attend it have highly circumscribed roles. Mayor, representatives of the Landkreis, professor, whether Protestant theology or Islamic theology. Migrants, students, and ordinary community members do not participate, and this produces predictable frustrations that occasionally spill out, as in the speech. One might say that the logic of rhetorical success, everything is great, produces an actual logic of failure. It's not that there's a failure of dialogue and this is concealed by a rhetoric of success, it's deeper than that. The imperative to say everything is a success is the very thing that causes the failures. Cornali et al. Put it bluntly. The younger generation of Muslims are unimpressed. They reject the premises of a merely symbolic, harmonious, interreligious exchange. So, what are the younger Muslim generation doing? A lot. Young people in Osnabrück who are Muslims typically do not appear in analyses by those who are doing the interreligious work. So these are brought to the fore in this study, and it's arguably the most distinctive contribution of their account. Young Muslims work against radicalization. They often engage each other, especially when some of their fellow young folk write inflammatory posts on social media, or when they seriously contemplate joining violent Salafi groups. The Christians deny there's any Salafism at all in Osnabrück. The students are working against actual Salafi recruitment in the city. They run, and this is really interesting, they run contemplative retreats and prayer spaces. They host art and culture events for Muslim groups. It's an extraordinary celebration of Muslim youthful aesthetic and political action. These youth initiatives operate almost completely independently of the official Osnabrück interreligious scene, and yet the official interreligious scene often celebrate their successes as Osnabrück successes. There are some dialogue events, but the young people, I mean, sometimes they go to them, sometimes they don't. They don't think they're particularly significant, when they may or may not in their actions involve non-Muslims. They do it when they need to, and they don't when they don't. There are no mayors and no professors anywhere in sight. Coniali et al. Are again blunt. The production of Muslim subjectivities, that is the hallmark of the official interreligious dialogues, which of course describe themselves as unofficial, they do not operate here. The younger generation are finding modes of engagement that bypass the imperatives to be compliant, the imperatives to have successful dialogue partners. These young people instead are somewhat brash, brave, and no-nonsense. And instead of meeting in seminar rooms and civic halls, they often meet in fast food restaurants, far from the guidance, the advice, and the friendship of official or dialogue processes. And the groups often missing from these activities are Christians. Christians are invited when they're needed, not when they're not. So I promised to give a well-defined problem and some accompanying questions that the problem gives rise to. So the problem is this. Interreligious dialogue is often figured as an informal, relaxed, convivial, friendly dialogue of equals, but this obscures asymmetries of participation, Tez Jan, urban myths of conviviality, Kurz and Nagel, the governmentality of friendship, Winkler, and merely symbolic harmonious exchange, Coniali et al. And this work, as I said at the outset, is not undertaken by scholars of interreligious engagement. It's done by German sociologists and geographers, and it's published in sociology and political science journals that may not be routinely consulted by scholars of interreligious engagement, and especially those who only consult English language sources. As I said, some of these sources are untranslated in German. So simply stated, interreligious dialogue is often a tool of government linked to integration policy in which academics collude, and which of us has not written this on a grant application, by promising that the outcomes of our work will be better integration, better harmony, increased conviviality, and deeper friendships. So the 5 questions that accompany this problem are perhaps these. How carefully managed do we think interreligious dialogue should be? Second, how tightly do we think we need to control the guest list? Third, how much of a success is it if we persuade minority communities to imitate majority institutions? 4, how important are displays and articulations of friendships? And 5, is there a meaningful alternative to state funding for interreligious dialogue? Before closing, and this is my last point, I wish to make one remark about the British interfaith scene that may contrast with that in Germany, and which explains the title of my lecture. The account I've offered deals in many contrasts, many contradictions, but the British context has another special contradiction. On the one hand, there's a strong imperative for participants in dialogue to be compliant, polite, approachable, friendly. In a word, rather Western, as Westerners conceive ourselves in our fantasy world. On the other hand, Muslim participants should be somewhat exotic, visibly foreign, preferably appearing in ethnic clothes, and ideally, above all, having impressively religious beards. The 2 core signs of success in the British context are, on the one hand, a joint communique between different religious traditions, and a photograph that captures the bearded company. And these 2 signs neatly express a contradiction. The communique should express what's acceptable, familiar, reassuring, and the photo should express what is exotic, traditional, authentic. I don't need to explain and elaborate the utterly racist and colonial undertones here. They're clearly no longer undertones, They're presented as tones, naked and unadorned, and the ideal participant is male. So I add one last question, number 6. How can we avoid the simultaneous and contradictory homogenization and exoticization of minority participants in interreligious engagement? Thank you.